listener production.
Hello, Sasha Barbagat with you. Welcome to The Briefing. The generation that's grown up asking Alexa to read them a bedtime story is now entering the workforce. Yes, Gen Alphas around the country are starting their first jobs. So what do we know about their work priorities? But more importantly, what are they going to be like to work with?
Most of them will have millennial parents, and millennial parents kind of came about of that time of well-being and kind of leading with empathy. So they'll enter the workforce, expecting kind of that psychological safety and sort of empathy from their leaders. And I think they'll expect that from day one.
That's coming up in the second half of this episode. But first, it is time for the headlines with Chris Spyrou, and it's Monday, the 17th of November.
Morning, Sash, and to you listening, happy Monday. The Coalition's rebrand is well and truly underway, with the Liberals and Nationals unveiling their new energy plan. It followed a week of marathon meetings in Canberra, with leader Susan Lee formally announcing a commitment to end net zero targets and focus instead on affordability and reliability in the energy grid by investing in what it calls a technology-neutral scheme. So that means things like coal, hydro and gas would continue to make up a big slice of Australia's electricity picture, but batteries and renewables would also be used in the right place.
The party also wants to hold off on closing coal-fired power stations until replacements for electricity generation are ready to take over. So, Chris, what they're doing here is honing in on the economic picture, and they don't want a bar of the climate change conversation. That's what they're doing by walking away from net zero. And that was made especially clear by Nationals leader David Littleproud, who made this comment yesterday.
This debate is not one predicated on science. It is one predicated on economics.
Yeah, so this is the first major policy position the Coalition has announced since its thumping defeat in the May election, as it looks to see how it can win back voters. Now, we've spoken about this and we did a lot last week when covering this story, but it's just so hard to see how this paves the way to luring millennial and Gen Z constituents. And we know they make up the biggest chunk of the Australian voting public right now. And just also Susan Lee, whose leadership has only narrowly survived the past week, has also flagged what their next policy focus will be: immigration.
In the coming weeks, we will release a migration policy, the broad principles of such a policy, that demonstrates what I have said from the get-go, which is that this country's migration numbers are far too high and this needs to be addressed as a priority.
Now, this is another hot button issue politically, with some corners blaming overseas migration for driving up prices on everything from groceries to housing. What the policy position is and how hardline it will be remains to be seen. Now, a little note, Susan Lee, when she does talk about migration, is a lot more measured compared to some others in the Liberal Party. For example, Senator Jacinta Nampijinpa-Price, who, those comments over Indian migration, she goes a lot harder on this. Susan Lee kind of chills in the middle and she's sensible when she does talk about it. However, what we learned with the climate chat and the net zero chat is, even though she might be a little bit more measured in this space, when it comes down to voting and when it comes down to holding on to power, she may make some compromises. Now, look, it is interesting. We are talking about all of this as fresh polling has dropped, showing that One Nation is at a record high, so polling around 18%, while the Coalition, the support for them is down at a record low. So while these conversations are unfolding over immigration and climate change, there are accusations that the Liberal Party and the Nationals and the Coalition are skewing in a way to capture and court One Nation voters. So very interesting to see how this space will unfold over the next week. Now, look, there are a bunch of questions that we have for Susan Lee, and I'm sure that you have for Susan Lee. Tash is sitting down with her today for this afternoon's edition of The Briefing. That will be in your feeds from about 4 o'clock.
Forget a snow day. Thousands of kids in Canberra are getting a sand day today.
I hereby declare this day to be Snow Day.
Yes, we have a joke, but it is quite serious. 69 schools have been closed in the capital today due to asbestos contamination risks in a brand of kinetic sand that's been used in classrooms across the ACT. Now, Kmart, Officeworks and Target, as well as other smaller retailers, do sell these products. And last week, the consumer watchdog issued a safety recall of them after lab testing found chrysotile asbestos, which is naturally occurring. On Friday, 16 schools and 6 preschools were closed in Canberra, along with one in Brisbane. But now dozens more have been forced to shut today amid the contamination fears.
Yeah, South Australia's Education Department, meantime, has identified 100 sites with the coloured sand products, but has issued a hazard alert to those schools rather than closing them. And it is worth noting the exposure risk from these sand products is low, but caution should obviously be taken. The ACCC has all the info if you need it on its website, and the whole saga has prompted calls for tougher testing of imported retail products.
To the US now, where rifts are emerging ahead of a vote this week to determine whether the full Epstein files will be released. It comes after thousands of documents held by the disgraced financier's estate were released by the government last week, some showing emails where Epstein referred to Donald Trump as the dog that hasn't barked, who had spent hours with one of his victims and, of course, knew about the girls.
Among the members of Congress set to vote in favour of releasing the files in the House of Representatives this week is longtime ally and defender of Trump, Marjorie Taylor Greene. This is the same Congresswoman, Sash, who Trump over the weekend called a traitor, a lunatic, and a disgrace to the great Republican Party on Truth Social after she questioned whether he was still putting America first and challenged the way he was handling the Epstein files.
His remarks, of course, have been hurtful. The most hurtful thing he said, which is absolutely untrue, is he called me a traitor, and that is so extremely wrong, and those are the types of words that can radicalize people against me and put my life in danger.
That audio is thanks to CNN. And a little note, Marjorie has come out to say that she's had to ramp up private security because the threats on her life post-Trump making these comments have really increased.
Says the woman who is one of the most hardline political figures who likes to go after people herself. As soon as it's coming the other way, she's not as happy to cop it, is she? Anyway, sorry, I just wanted to make that point. But also, why is there so much focus on these files? And, we've been hearing the term Epstein files thrown around for so long now. They are expected to show who was close with Epstein. Now, obviously, there are rumours, there are photographs, people already speculate about Donald Trump, but there is thought that this could either put to rest the rumours around Donald Trump or confirm the rumours about Donald Trump, which is why it's such a hot button political issue at the moment. And that's why the Dems are pushing so hard for it, and why Marjorie Taylor Greene's breaking from Republican ranks to vote for the release is so big.
We're constantly being told our phones are bad for us, and now there's another health risk that could be caused by our devices. Research out of the US has found a link between excessive screen use and dementia in young people. There's been a 400% jump in cases of people aged 30 to 44 being diagnosed with the cognitive condition, with the youngest known case globally just 19 years old.
And right now, 30,000 Aussies are living with younger onset dementia, and experts predict that number will rise to 50,000 over the coming years. And the condition is now the leading cause of death in Australia. So we know rates are soaring anyway. But now scientists and experts have made this link between excessive screen time and dementia. They've also flagged a 10-year national decline in IQ rates and increasing ADHD cases in kids. So I guess the concern is that at the very least, our addiction to screens is making us dumb and unable to concentrate.
And the overpriced, devilish-looking plush toys that have taken over the world are getting a movie. Yes, Sony Pictures has acquired the rights to Labubu and is in early developments for a feature film which, if it all goes to plan, would create a whole new franchise. Just what we need, Sasha.
Yeah, I've got thoughts. I'll share them in a sec. But this deal was signed last week between the Chinese toy makers PopMart and Sony. And we have no details yet as to who would be producing or directing, or even if it'll be an animation or a live remake. So details to come, Chris. But Labubu, the movie, is apparently on the way. Look, I hate to sound like an old person when I'm about to say this, but I completely missed the boat with this Labubu stuff because it happened right after I gave birth to my son.
Yes.
And I was just nowhere in any sort of way focusing on anything going on outside my four walls. What on earth is a Labubu? I know, I sound like an old person, but what are these things and why do we care if it gets a movie?
Can I just say, also, you missed out on nothing because this is peak consumerism, peak capitalism. When you boil it all down, it's all BS. It's a money-making exercise, but it has swept the world, and it's very purposefully swept the world. I did a deep dive on this. I fell down the rabbit hole because I wanted to understand it. We'll pop a link to that in the show notes. But look, it all started with a celebrity plug. Blackpink, one of the singers from Blackpink was wearing a Labubu on her handbag. Then Rihanna picked up the trend. Then Dua Lipa picked up the trend, and poof, spread like wildfire.
So they're just little figurines.
They're little figurines. They can attach to your handbag. They attach to people's school bags, like kids' school bags. That's where you're mostly going to see them. And a lot of the team upstairs have them on their desks. So, yeah, look, a collectible though, like a really rare one, can sell for up to $10,000 on the not black market, but the second-hand market. I mean, there is a black market, I guess, for Labubus as well. But anyway, whatever. Look, a movie's coming. Are you excited by it? Are you not? We'll pop a prompt up in our broadcast channel. Let us know your thoughts.
Oh, my goodness. Well, I know where I sit. But that brings our headlines to a close for today. Thank you so much for joining us. Coming up next is Chris's Deep Dive, looking at Gen Alpha entering the workforce. What a perfect segue after Labubu. Have a listen to that up next.
My mum, like most Gen Xers in this country, is still in the workforce, and my brother and I often think about how her colleagues cope working with her. But apparently she's somewhat of an office celebrity who's coerced 90% of her office, including the young'uns among the pack, into listening to the briefing every single morning. Hi, y'all. The point is, my mum is someone else's work mum, and she's set to add more to her flock now that Gen Alpha has come of age and is entering the workforce. The kiddies born between 2010 and 2024 are becoming employees, and it got us wondering, what will they be like at work? What's important to them, and how will their habits and work values stack up against ours? Natalie Petruzziello is a psychologist who's worked in HR for more than a decade, including here at Listener, where she has to deal with hundreds of people right across the country, myself included. Natty P, welcome to the briefing.
Hello, Chris. Thank you.
Before we get into Gen Alpha, what can you tell us about the generational makeup of Australia's current workforce?
So I think what we're experiencing right now in the workforce is really interesting and kind of historically unique. So for the first time, we have 4 generations working alongside one another, and that's soon to be 5 with Alpha coming in. So I think it's something we haven't experienced before, and it's probably why we're seeing all those funny TikToks about jamming out with, your friend's parent in the lunchroom, because you're sort of having exposure to people you'd never ordinarily have in your outside world. I think from a psychological perspective, it brings to us sort of the most age and cognitive diversity in a workforce. So I think it's an exciting time. I think a lot of people are sort of fearing it and worried about it. But I think if we think about the diversity everyone can bring to the workforce, I think there's a lot of opportunity there that we can tap into.
And we'll talk a little bit more about that opportunity in a second. But generally speaking, what are the key characteristics we're dealing with when we're talking about these 4 generations? So I'm assuming we're talking here about boomers, Gen X, Gen Y/millennials, and Gen Z. What are the key characteristics of those generations when it comes to work?
So I'll caveat this first by saying that there are some sort of broad tendencies, but they're not hard truths. So I think we need to keep that in mind anytime we're sort of talking to a group of people that belong to a category.
Yes, I know you don't love talking in generational terms, and I did have to coerce you into talking about this topic.
We'll go on that rant a bit later. Typically for boomers, we see that they value loyalty, structure, personal relationships. They came about work during that time where you'd sort of stay loyal to one employer and very much work your way up. Gen X, so they sort of worked during a lot of economic uncertainty. They were sort of that first generation to really experience sort of recession and the impacts of that in the workplace. So they became quite sort of pragmatic problem solvers. They learned to become a lot more self-reliant and independent just because of sort of what was going on in the context at the time. Millennials, so I think fellow millennial here, we very much kind of introduced the whole language and concept of work-life balance and purpose-driven work. So wanting sort of work that provided meaning, not just sort of an exchange transactional scenario. We want something that provides us with meaning, we want balance, but also we want collaboration and we want feedback. So that sort of shifted. And again, that's just, they came of a time with digital sort of disruption started to come into the workforce as well. We had technology that could sort of automate certain processes. So that sort of was taken care of. And then we came in kind of thinking jobs should offer us more purpose. We're not just coming in to exchange our time for money. We want it to, it creates sort of part of our identity. So millennials really sort of, I guess, brought out that idea a bit more and placed that expectation a little bit more on employers.
Which then brings us to my generation. I'll wave the Gen Z flag unashamedly.
Yeah.
Natty P, what can you tell us about the general characteristics of my gen?
A lot of Gen Z kind of were studying or finalising uni or starting in the workforce as graduates during sort of the height of COVID. So, we can't discount the impact that a pandemic has on people's learning styles and preferences. There also came about of social media and sort of the social media boom and being so integrated into our daily lives. I think Gen Z, they're quite pragmatic. They care deeply about inclusion and mental health. And I think their expectations of employers are really, they're quite critical of things such as, social impact and sustainability. And I think, we see in interviews with Gen Z, they will be asking, what is the company doing from a sustainability perspective? What are they doing from a values perspective? And they're more likely to make decisions on career prospects based on those elements of a workplace.
So that brings us now to this new generation coming in, Gen Alpha, which is something I just can't believe I'm already talking about. I can't believe we're sitting here talking about Gen Alpha joining the workforce. What are we expecting when it comes to this generation and why?
I think it's super interesting. I think with Gen Alpha, they're going to be the first fully AI native generation. So I think Gen Z have traditionally been called digital natives because they sort of went through school and came through on the rise of technology. But if we add an extra layer to that, sort of Alpha, they've grown up with AI. They've grown up with, asking Alexa to play them a bedtime story. I look at my friends' kids and they know how to, stream something from the iPhone to their TV before even being able to have a conversation. So it's so ingrained in their day-to-day. So if I think about them entering the workforce, I think they're going to expect a lot of sort of seamless processes and rapid processes from a business. I think what will be interesting is seeing kind of Gen Alpha enter more traditional businesses or traditional industries because, they'll enter workforces where there's quite, from their perspective, archaic or arduous processes. And we know that change takes time. So I think that's maybe where you'll see some tensions in terms of expectations and what the workforce is offering them.
Something that a lot of people think about when more young people are entering the workforce or their workspace is communication styles. Now, you and I communicate very differently to how you communicate with other colleagues. A lot of the ways that I reply to your emails or don't reply to your emails is something that you take note of often.
Yes.
What are some of the communication styles that we are to expect when it comes to Gen Alpha coming in? Because something like the Gen Z stare is things we've spoken about before, this idea that Gen Z kind of lacked human interaction during COVID and that kind of informed the way that they deal with customers in a hospitality setting or in a retail setting, the fact that they might just stare blankly dead ahead at you and you're like, wait, am I being served right now? Is there something coming through when it comes to Gen Alpha when we're talking about communication styles?
Yeah. They sort of touched on communication styles because I think a lot of the differences, we sort of draw on a lot of differences between generations, but a lot of it comes down to just different communication preferences and styles. I think with Gen Alpha, they're sort of used to more sort of rapid communication. They're used to sort of being always available sort of with their friends and probably using digital forums and more of that sort of ad hoc impromptu conversation is what they're used to. And I think that sort of, is probably at odds with if we maybe look at sort of Boomer and Gen X who might prefer sort of more structured communications or are used to being in the workforce where, you put time in the diary to have a meeting where, Gen Alpha are probably a bit more fluid. I think that's kind of one of the differences we'll see or probably what we see. Gen Z stare. I mean, I think that's just Gen Z processing in real time. It's what I like to think, that they're just processing my deep thoughts or they're just zoning me out, which is what you often do.
Okay, she got an attack in there. Ladies and gentlemen, she managed to get a dig in there too. Well done, Natty P. I'm curious to get your read on this. You mentioned that there will be some tensions and that kind of happens anytime that a new generation enters the workforce. Which generation do you think might struggle the most to work with this generation that's going to be coming in soon?
If we probably look at it just by virtue of technology probably being the main difference in those generations, I think, perhaps Gen X, like I said, who probably grew up with, just a very different form of communication, or even boomers who prefer more formal communication. So they could find sort of alphas, shorthand and slang and kind of impromptu communication a bit overwhelming, and just out of the ordinary to what they're used to. But I think it's less about generation and probably down to work style preferences. So I think people who favour formal face-to-face conversation will just find that particular communication style more difficult anyway.
At the beginning of the chat, you kind of referenced this idea that the millennials were the first generation to kind of prioritise work-life balance, introduced work-life balance into the workplace, and that's something that's anecdotally, Gen Z is carrying through as well at the moment. Do you see that following through with Gen Alpha, or do you see a pendulum swing back to this idea of staying loyal to a company and doing over and doing unpaid over and doing all these things? I know we have the right to disconnect now in the legislation and legally in Australia, but do you see Gen Alpha caring that much about work-life balance as, say, Gen Z and Y?
Yeah, I think it'll continue on from what I'm seeing and kind of what I'm reading in the research. I think Gen Z kind of started a lot of that getting comfortable with discussions around boundary setting at work. And you're right, the sort of right to disconnect has kind of came in and reinforced that. I think Gen Alpha will probably demonstrate a continuation of that in terms of kind of, boundaries and focusing on their well-being as well. I think you need to also remember that Gen Alpha, most of them will have millennial parents, and millennial parents kind of came about of that time of well-being and kind of leading with empathy. So they'll enter the workforce, expecting kind of that psychological safety and sort of empathy from their leaders. And I think they'll expect that, from day one. So it's not a nice to have, it'll just become something that they expect. So yeah, look, it'll be interesting to see what happens, but I imagine it'll be more of a continuation of some of the concepts Gen Z has introduced, and Alpha will sort of continue that. As I said, we're kind of sitting side by side with 4 different generations. So a one-size-fits-all approach will no longer work. The way you get the best out of people, even taking away generation, is sort of meeting people where they're at and understanding what motivates someone, if we're thinking about what life stage are they at, what are their goals, what are their aspirations, what challenges do they have. I think you're going to get a lot more out of that conversation than making an assumption based on a generalised, a generation that they're a part of. I think what we see in the research and what's interesting is actually the differences between generations is less significant than we'd think, and there's probably more variation within a generation. So if you have 3 millennials in your team, they're probably a lot more different than what you think. In terms of kind of what they expect from work and sort of their goals and what they want. So across the generations, what we tend to see is a lot of consistency in terms of people wanting a sense of belonging, a sense of purpose, psychological safety, and that remains pretty constant despite the generation you're in. So yeah, we're a lot more similar than you think, but we just might express it a little bit differently.
Which is a beautiful note to end this chat on. Natty P, thanks so much for joining us on The Briefing.
Thank you.
That was psychologist and HR specialist Natalie Petruzziello speaking with me there, and that is it for this episode of The Briefing. If you enjoyed this chat, why not flick it over to a mate? And if you learned something new, why not flick it over to a colleague or a manager of yours? Every share counts, and while you're there, leave us a rate and a review. I'm Spyrou. I'll catch you next time.